evening and welcome to the forum at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. My name is Bob Putnam. I'm the dean of the school, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here. John Kennedy used to say that failure was an orphan, but success had 1,000 fathers. He meant to say 1,000 parents. That suggests that this evening's forum should be a splendid event, because I'm now about to list the organizations that join with the Kennedy School in co-sponsoring this event. The Institute of Politics, the Center for Science and International Affairs, the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, the Energy and Environmental Policy Student Interest Group, and Project 88. We've organized this very special forum in dedication to a man who was deeply and productively committed to solving society's toughest problems and making a difference, United States Senator John Heintz. As the nation mourns his tragic and untimely death, tonight we honor the life and the environmental legacy of the senator from Pennsylvania. We're extremely pleased that Teresa Heintz, the senator's wife and a longtime and very articulate environmentalist herself, has joined us for this special event this evening. Market-based strategies for environmental protection, the title of this evening's forum, gets at the heart of Senator Heintz's environmental legacy. In collaboration with his lifelong friend and colleague in the Senate, Tim Wirth of Colorado, John Heintz initiated Project 88, a series of creative policy proposals that reconcile what many people had once thought to be irreconcilable: market incentives, market forces, and environmental protection. Project 88, which I'm pleased to say is housed here at the Kennedy School under the leadership of Professor Rob Stavens, has been described by someone as putting a green thumb on the invisible hand of Adam Smith. Project 88's powerful and practical ideas have been acted on not only by Bill Riley's EPA, by the U.S. Congress, by President Bush, but also increasingly by governments elsewhere in the world, in Eastern and Western Europe, for example. Project 88 is literally transforming the character of the discussion, the dialogue, and the debate over environmental protection. Thanks to the support that's been generated by Senator Heintz and Senator Wirth, the Kennedy School has had an opportunity to stay intimately involved with this very special project. And over the next year and a half, with Rob Stavens quarterbacking, we'll host a series of seminars and policy workshops. Today, I think, was the first of these workshops on incentive-based approaches to environmental protection. And beginning next summer, we will organize student internships in Washington and in state capitals across the country to enable Harvard students to help implement the policy, the action recommendations of Project 88. When the project's Round 2 report was published just last week, the New York Times headlined it, More green for less gold. This report, like its predecessor a little over 2 years ago, incorporates counsel from leaders in business and in government, from academia, and from the environmental community. This inclusive approach to problem solving goes to the core of our mission here at the Kennedy School. If we can bring together disparate groups to solve our common problems, I think we can make a lot of progress on solving the long list of problems that are facing our country today. Project 88, as I've said on other occasions, is a model of the kind of creative blend of far-sighted ideas and practical political realism that represents the Kennedy School at its best. So I'm delighted tonight to be able to introduce this forum, and I want now to turn the rest of the evening over to the moderator of this evening's panel, Professor Stavens, a Harvard-trained economist, a former Peace Corps volunteer, and for the last 3 years a professor at the Kennedy School and director of Project 88. Rob?
Thank you, Bob. Our forum program tonight is dedicated, as Bob Putnam has just said, To the memory of Senator John Heintz of Pennsylvania, the Washington Post recently noted that what made Senator Heintz stand out in the Senate was the tenacity, the word that one keeps hearing, the tenacity with which he worked on behalf of those who lack an effective voice. The elderly, the chronically ill, children, those caught in the grip of poverty, and we must add the natural environment. His commitment to innovative approaches to environmental protection was full and it was unconditional. He co-chaired Project 88, of course, with his close friend and colleague, Senator Timothy Wirth, and thereby brought credibility to the idea of harnessing market forces to protect the environment. An idea which we should not forget was not politically popular just 3 years ago. Senator Heintz went on to demonstrate great political courage, I remember, by embracing the first Project 88 report with its recommendation of the then controversial idea of a tradable permit program for acid rain control, an idea which was later adopted by the administration, of course, in its clean air proposals, and subsequently enacted by the Congress and signed into law by the President. A chain of events in which EPA Administrator William Riley, of course, played an absolutely pivotal role. Round 2 of Project 88 was again initiated and sponsored jointly by Senator Wirth and Senator Heintz. Their second report, Designing Market-Based Environmental Strategies, was released by Senator Wirth just last week in Washington. And as Senator Wirth says in the foreword to the report, it is now part of the legacy of John Heintz. Before turning to our panelists, I wanted to say a very few words about our subject for the evening, market-based strategies for environmental protection. As many of you know, these innovative approaches recognize market forces, and they recognize market forces not only being the source of environmental problems, which of course they are, but also as being potentially part of the solution to environmental problems, which they can indeed be. I'm referring to mechanisms that we'll hear more about later from our panelists, such as pollution charges, tradable permits, deposit refund systems, among others. These incentive-based policies force consumers and producers, both, to experience the full costs and consequences of their decisions, not afterwards when it's too late to affect their decisions, but before the case. And it's in that way that they provide very powerful incentives for environmental protection. Importantly, these approaches to environmental protection can enable us to achieve our environmental goals at lower overall cost of compliance than conventional policies. And they provide ongoing incentives for the development and the adoption of cheaper and better pollution control technologies. And as I suggested at the beginning, over the past 3 years, we've witnessed an absolutely dramatic change in the reception given by members of the policy community to these market-based environmental strategies. Tonight, in order to explore together, all of us in this room, these innovative policies, we have with us an exceptionally distinguished panel. William Riley, the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I might add, was involved from the very beginning in the Project 88 effort. Back in June of 1988, I was in Washington for my very first meeting with Senators Heintz and Wirth to talk about their new project. After we'd gone over some of the basics, they immediately had the same idea. They both decided to get on the phone to their friend Bill Riley, who was then president of the Conservation Foundation, to solicit his perspective, to solicit his guidance. Tonight, in addition to William Riley, who will shortly be introduced to you, and Timothy Wirth, who I'll introduce later, we're fortunate to have with us Claudine Schneider. Claudine was, as you probably know, a Republican congresswoman from Rhode Island for 10 years. And while in the House of Representatives, she was, of course, extremely active on environmental issues and was a principal co-sponsor with Senator Wirth and Senator Heintz of a set of bills which apply incentive-based approaches to solid and hazardous waste problems. Prior to her election to the Congress, she was the executive director of the Conservation Law Foundation. And most recently, in 1990, she was the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate in Rhode Island. We might say now that Rhode Island's loss has turned out to be Harvard's gain, since Claudine has spent the past semester as a fellow at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. I'm pleased to turn to Claudine now, who will introduce to us Administrator Riley. Claudine Schneider.
It is certainly an honor to have the opportunity to participate in this forum, which is dedicated to the memory of Senator Heintz. And I cannot proceed, although I was asked to be succinct with my introduction, I cannot let this opportunity pass for me to share with all of you what a very critical loss it is that we no longer have Senator Heintz to be the very progressive, optimistic, and active leader, my kind of Republican, in the U.S. Senate. But needless to say, his loss is not only felt by his family members, by the entire state of Pennsylvania and this nation, but we too, in his memory, are offering the information and the optimism that we can through this forum in order to hopefully inspire and mobilize many of you to help implement the suggestions and recommendations that we will be sharing this evening. And now let me take this opportunity to introduce one of my very dear friends, Bill Riley. Now, I'm sure that all of you know that he has had a distinguished career in the environmental community for many years now. He's been the president of the World Wildlife Fund and of the Conservation Foundation, and when those two organizations joined, he continued to be president of the two of them. And prior to that, he was the executive director of the Task Force on Land Use and Urban Growth, and he was a senior staff member of the President's Council on Environmental Quality, and also the chairman of the Natural Resources Council of America back in 1981 to 1983. Well, let me also share with you that probably what is most significant about Bill Riley is that he has his law degree from Harvard University. And then, too, for those of you who are from Fall River, he went to high school in Fall River. So he does have certainly some Massachusetts ties. But I am hopeful that all of you are much more aware of the more current history of Bill Riley. When he was sworn in on February 8, 1989, as the 7th administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, it was with unanimous confirmation of his nomination by the Senate. He has been noted since taking that office for his championing of the integration of the nation's environmental and economic agendas, and in emphasizing the importance of relying on science at EPA. In addition to that, he has been fostering innovative technological cleanup processes and also the preventing of pollution before it is generated. His pivotal role in the design and crafting of the Clean Air Bill, which was passed by Congress just recently, finally broke a 10-year stalemate in the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act. This act is an innovative, market-oriented emissions trading system that will cut sulfur dioxide pollution in half. In addition to that, Bill Riley has elevated attention to restoring the health of our natural systems, including the Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes, and his emphasis has been very much on pollution prevention. Mr. Riley has also played a leading role in asserting environmental priorities in U.S. foreign policy. And I don't know how many of you remember, but I was spending time with Bill Riley in my own Senate campaign when he was just working his way through the Two Forks Dam veto. And I think that this is a piece of legislation by all means. His recognition early on about the demand-side opportunities and the role of water conservation technologies showed him to be the kind of man that we needed to head up the Environmental Protection Agency. It was important for me, even though that was information was not provided to me in his resume, that I share this with you, because it strictly points to the fact that we have as our administrator a man of integrity, a man of guts, a man of vision, and one who has the unique talent and the ability of turning ideas into action. Actions that will enhance the quality of life, not only for all Americans, but for all people on this planet. And it is this kind of man that I am very honored to have the opportunity to work with, and we look forward to hearing from you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudine. I will take as my first challenge the need to rise to that high-energy introduction. I'm not sure I can hold the pace. we need you back in Washington. It's not been the same in terms of productivity, creativity, and energy since you left. Well, that was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate your mentioning the Two Forks Dam. I don't always appreciate when people mention my role in vetoing that $500 million project, but particularly in the presence of Senator Worth, who knows a little about it. And I can recall one of my predecessors said after I made that decision, and he invited me to visit him at his country home, Bill Ruckels's house, his country place in Seattle. He said, I think it's still possible to get from Washington to Seattle without changing planes in Denver. I would advise it. Now, let me say publicly what I've never done before is I appreciate very much the support of Senator Worth, Colorado, for my having made that decision. I think it was the right decision. We begin tonight's program in the presence of Teresa Heintz, whom I have just heard speak a few minutes ago, and share now with her husband a strong sense of pleasure that I do not have to follow her, which apparently was a rule of his. Eloquent, succinct, and moving. We are all privileged, those of us who had dinner with you tonight, to hear your brief remarks. Dean Putnam, we will miss you when you leave your position. You have been a strong supporter for Project 88. I know that Al Carnesale is going to continue that support. And I want to recognize the evening's moderator, Rod Stavens, who has done an outstanding job as director of Project 88, just as he did also on the Environmental Protection Agency's Science Advisory Board, an independent body of scientists and engineers to which we look increasingly for objective, authoritative, scientific advice on which we hope to base all of our regulatory decisions. Well, I spent some time in Cambridge some years ago, and I particularly like to come back in the spring. My law school roommate, Benny Zucker, and my friend Lee Grove are here to support me when I do. Incidentally, Lee Grove's new book, Drowning, is prominently displayed in the windows of the Harvard Coop, and I encourage you all to buy it. That's called a market incentive, Lee, wherever you're sitting. Bob Hope, whose son was a law school classmate of ours, once said that for over 300 years, Harvard has been producing more politicians than any other university in the world. But they've made up for it in other ways. Well, one of those politicians was John Heintz, a senator for whom no excuses were ever necessary. I spent the day with him in Pittsburgh the Friday before he died, and he introduced me to a group of prominent Pittsburgh business leaders and then to a dinner audience. And he spoke very proudly of his own and of our shared environmental record in the last couple of years. And I said that evening, and will repeat tonight, that when the environmental history of this era is written, John Heintz will be recognized for a seminal contribution. I had a new secretary back in, I guess it was 1987. I'm not sure when that call came through, and I was in the conference room of the Conservation Foundation and was told that Senator Heintz was calling. By the time I had gotten back to my office, I was advised that on the other line was Senator Worth. And I kind of shrugged and tried to imply to my secretary that this kind of thing happened every day. And I wasn't sure which call to take first, but it didn't matter because they were both calling on behalf of the same request. And it was that I become engaged with a project, Project 88, and meet its director and advise on its conceptualization. Well, the work of Project 88, both the conceptual contribution and the legitimacy that that project won by having distinguished environmentally progressive senators from both parties, and also from having the key support of the Environmental Defense Fund, transformed the concept of market incentives from academic theory into national environmental policy. The ideas of Project 88, harnessing market forces to protect our environment, moved with remarkable speed to the stage of enactment, thanks in great part to the authority and credibility of its senatorial sponsors. Project 88 Round 2, Incentives for Action, Implementing Market-Based Environmental Strategies, released just last week, has, I think, as much promise and in many respects confronts fewer obstacles of unfamiliarity and ideological resistance than did the original 88 report. Now, the standard line on market incentives to achieve environmental objectives used to be as follows: for figures in industry to express theoretical adherence and acceptance, but to say that the political process was not sufficiently attuned and would, in fact, if ever any market incentive found its way into law, so layer it with command and control regulations that the one would cancel out the other, and that industry, the regulated industry, would end up with having to accommodate two highly demanding and divergent sets of demands. Environmentalists tended to take the view that market incentives to achieve environmental objectives was a kind of exaggerated oxymoron, that markets, after all, were the problem. They didn't pay any attention to externalities, and they severely discounted the future. And it was them that we were trying to correct for. Moreover, the moral sensibilities of environmentalists were offended by the idea of acquiescing in a modicum of pollution, in legitimizing pollution, as market incentives, emissions trading, offsets, and the rest, in a sense, do. But let me say at the outset, we in the Bush administration are committed to both the concept and the process of market incentives. Both Dick Darman and I agree on that. More fundamentally, President Bush is profoundly committed to expressing in our market economy the full possibilities of applying our wealth to get this country green growth. So it is we now promote the potential for using the market on behalf of the environment. Inspired very much by Project 88, I initiated an EPA task force to study incentive-based proposals generated throughout the Environmental Protection Agency. And last month, the task force released an important new report, Economic Incentives, Options for Environmental Protection. As you know, we have made an unprecedented commitment to market incentives in our Clean Air Act of 1990, signed last fall by President Bush. The acid rain title in that law provides for a reduction of about half of the sulfur dioxides that we presently release into the environment of the United States. But it says that those companies which are capable of achieving more than their allotted maximum of emissions are free to trade the increment of over-control to companies which may find it more profitable to purchase such credits than to invest to reduce an equivalent amount themselves. And over dinner we speculated on why it was that that proposal proceeded so fast from the point of announcement to enactment in some 18 months. Well, I think that one reason, surely, was the source of the idea, which I described. Another, surely, was the very substantial commitment it represented. A 10 million ton in sulfur dioxides is a very ambitious goal. And I think some were disposed to give us credit, believe that we had won some bona fides in making a commitment of this sort, and perhaps deserved to be given the opportunity to experiment in this way. But of course, one of the very significant advantages of this approach is that according to numbers derived by the Council on Economic Advisors, it promised to reduce by almost a quarter the total cost of our acid rain controls in the United States, by some $800 million per year. And so that instead of seeing this as a proposed permit to pollute program, people came to see it the way the project sponsors of Project 88 had conceived of this concept, as a way to make scarce resources go farther, to get us more reductions for a constant amount of money. Well, I think that the acid rain title in the Clean Air Act of 1990 will stand as a memorial to Jack Heintz. And I will here dedicate myself with some trepidation tonight to doing all I can not to screw it up in implementation. That is no idle commitment. It's an extraordinarily complex, unprecedented, demanding job that the Environmental Protection Agency has to realize the potential of this title. We have thus far succeeded in getting our strategy for implementation of the Clean Air Act developed and the initial decisions made on time. We will need the help of a great many people, of industry, of environmentalists, of all interested supporters of a better environment to make this title work. It was Lord Eric Ashby who once characterized the challenge to our century and our generation in terms of three crucial reconciliations. The reconciliation of man with man, necessary to avoid nuclear war. The reconciliation of humankind with the wealth and resources of this earth in order to triumph over the poverty that oppresses the soul and undermines civilization. And the reconciliation of humans with nature, so necessary if natural systems are to continue to sustain life on Earth. But I think that John Heintz understood America's need for a fourth reconciliation, and not just America's, but the world's. A reconciliation between the proponents of economic growth and the advocates of environmental protection. You know the people that, according to Dick Darman, our nation fought World War II to make the world safe for green vegetables. It was Dick, incidentally, who described me as the administration's global rock star. Imagery that I liked, but no more than my 16-year-old daughter, who decided when she heard that maybe, after all, her dad was doing important work. I think it's important to say at the outset, as we consider new departures in environmental protection, that this field is perhaps the most clear example of a great success, I think maybe the greatest success of recent public policy history. Our achievements with respect to the environment are measurable and indisputable. We've reduced carbon monoxides in our cities by 30%, sulfur dioxides by a third, particulates by 64%, lead by 97%. We've begun to bring the Great Lakes back. This set of achievements is a highly admired and much coveted American experience. Other countries desperately want to learn from our experience. But our experience, for all of its successes, have two limitations. Much of what we have achieved has been purchased at the cost of great contention, confrontation, and litigation that has added to expense and to the time necessary to clean up the country. The second limitation is the increasing cost of continued incremental environmental improvements. We released a report recently, The Costs of a Clean Environment, that makes clear that we currently in the United States are spending just under 2% of our gross national product on air, water, and waste management. And that by the end of the decade, we expect that figure will rise to about 3%. That is a number that is higher for the United States than for virtually all countries with which I am familiar, with the possible exception of Germany, Canada, and the Netherlands, which as a matter of policy is going to spend 4%. I mention it not because I think we can't afford it, but because I think it makes clear the obligation we all have at that level of expenditure of our treasure to get it right. We approach in the environment, in some areas, the point of diminishing returns. I testified last Friday before a committee of the House of Representatives on safe drinking water and looked at a projected set of regulations that will have us regulating atrazine and allichlor in the coming years, with the possibility that the cost of controlling those toxics will be the equivalent of spending more than $1 billion per cancer death avoided. We confront problems in the environment today that are highly diffuse, that don't have the same characteristic of a visible, high-volume, and controllable polluter. Problems that are diffuse, like non-point source runoff from farms and streets and forests and highway projects. I remember being told a few months ago in Los Angeles that a good Los Angelino didn't trust air that he couldn't see. And he may be right, because where pollution used to be conceived of as visible, now it's the stuff you can't see that will do you in. Well, our response to this problem, this new set of problems that we face to some degree because of the successes we've had in dealing with the more obvious, visible, telegenic, viscous pollution, grotesque pollution that we confronted over the past 20 years, I think must be increasingly on preventing pollution. And that is to say, on strategies for environmental protection that transcend traditional end-of-the-pipe cleanup, using new materials, fuels, processes, and products to eliminate a generation of waste before it's created. Incidentally, before I left Washington for the flight up this afternoon, a commercial flight, I should add, I released initial results of EPA's new toxics release inventory. This is a revolutionary tool in our arsenal, one the potential of which I think was not appreciated by its legislative authors in the beginning. It's one that requires us to obtain from plants the information about some 300 toxic pollutants and the amounts that are released to the air and the water and the land every year. It enhances our ability to measure and to monitor, target, ultimately to prevent pollution from these sources, to have that information made available to neighbors and to workers, to stockholders and to newspapers and to members of Congress, to all of us annually. Well, the results reveal that total releases and transfers of these chemicals decreased from 7 billion pounds in 1987, lawful releases, to 5.7 billion pounds in 1989, representing an 18% decrease over 3 years. Some of this, by the way, represents a correction of previously inaccurate numbers, but I think the fact is unmistakable. We are making progress. And using this kind of information, I have written to 600 chief executive officers of the corporations that release the largest amounts of these chemicals, asking that they reduce 17 of the most toxic of them by 33% by next year and by 50% by 1995. Next week I will announce the results of those requests, but I can say tonight that we have received about a quarter of the answers we had hoped for, and many corporations, significant corporations, large releasers of these chemicals, are committing to goals that go well beyond what I'd asked them to. I think that suggests that we are in a new era. A few weeks ago, I visited the 3M Corporation plant in St. Paul. Just about a year ago, before we negotiated revisions in the Montreal Protocol to phase out chlorofluorocarbons, we received a very persuasive letter from that corporation, a major generator of methylchloroform, indicating that a schedule that would have this country phasing out of that chemical by the year 2000 would result in the loss of thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. We took that seriously. The goal for phase-out of methylchloroform is 2005, but I learned just before visiting 3M Corporation that they expect to have fully phased it out within about 2 years. We are in the presence, I think, of a new ethic, both of our people and increasingly of our corporate leaders. It is an ethic that searches for practical ways to make serious progress in the near future. It's an ethic that responds more than anything else to the fact that the environment has entered the core values of the American people. Let those who still doubt the wisdom of pollution prevention, or who still believe that there remains some fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, let them first consult many of these companies which have saved money or made money by achieving pollution prevention. And let them also, if they're still in doubt, visit Eastern Europe and see the Vistula River in Poland, over 80% of whose length the waters don't permit of use for industrial cooling. They're so corrosive. Or let them experience sulfur dioxide levels in Krakow, which have, in the period of just 40 years, corroded some 500-year-old monuments. And let them see the spiraling rates of infant mortality and worker absenteeism and emphysema and premature deaths and all of the rest. Places that, well, like Poland, where the environment minister told me that 15% of the gross national product is now allocated to correcting for environmental problems, health-related impairments of economic productivity. The lessons of Eastern Europe, I think, as of other places, are very clear. A clean and healthy environment, healthy natural systems are a prerequisite for sustained economic prosperity. And conversely, the lesson here at home is equally clear. Economic prosperity is essential for future environmental progress. Sustainable economic growth can and really must be the engine of environmental improvement. As a nation, we must build upon these lessons. In looking back at American experience and some of those numbers that I cited of pollution reduction, a number I did not cite was the increase in our gross national product during that period. It was about 60%. It was that provided the engine for so much of our environmental progress, that paid for the catalytic converters and the elimination of lead from our air, and for the scrubbers, and for the pollution control, and for so many of the other investments that have created the prospect for a different quality of health and environment today than we had then. Let me just close by saying that we will see very soon in the Congress a vote on fast-track legislation for Mexican free trade. And I think that free trade with Mexico offers an unprecedented opportunity to ratchet up the environmental protection, to improve the health, and begin to bring back impaired natural systems for some 85 million people. They don't want for commitment. I myself heard President Salinas at a meeting with President Bush and the industrial leadership of both our countries last December in Monterrey, Mexico, say to the assembled group, "We do not want dirty jobs in Mexico. We want a higher standard of living, and a vital component of a higher standard of living is a better quality of environment. Send us only your clean jobs. It is all we will accept." Mexicans have learned the lessons of Eastern Europe. They now have the prospect, through free trade, to get the resources necessary to make the investments that will realize their dreams. And I very much hope that the Congress gives them that opportunity. Finally, let me enter another point, perhaps a little more surprising in this audience, but I suspect not so coming from the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Let us remember the values and the merits of regulations. I found myself prepared to give a speech, a stem winder, on the values of the market in Eastern Europe last September, and talked to enough environment ministers there and others to realize that They are committed to the market to the point of having forgotten that we have a system of regulation that has corrected for its excesses, and it is on that that we build our market incentives today. Regulations have provided the foundation, and we look to a new, sophisticated generation of market incentives to take us where they cannot take us. But we are not deregulators. We are, in the Bush administration, I hope, cost-effective regulators, better regulators, less intrusive and more respectful of those regulated, and more attuned to helping them achieve their objectives in ways that further environmental objectives. So let me conclude with a reminder, too, that there is at bottom a moral dimension to environmental protection. The public knows that. Not everything has a price. Some things cannot be traded. Command and control has a place in regulation, as in the Persian Gulf. But we have scarcely begun to plumb the possibilities of market incentives. It is a field of uncountable flowers waiting to be plucked. It's one of the significant policy innovations of our time, and I look forward very much to helping fulfill its potential. Thank you.
Now I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce to you Senator Timothy Wirth of Colorado. I've been able to work with Senator Wirth for 3 years now on Project 88 and other efforts, and I might tell a brief story here. Back in June of 1988, when Senator Heintz and Senator Wirth first asked me to direct this project for them, my recollection is that they said they were interested in, quote, innovative approaches to environmental protection, unquote, and that I should investigate 8 to 10 major problem areas and come up with innovative solutions, and that I had 5 weeks to do it. That was because Senator Heintz wanted to take the first draft of the report to the Republican National Convention in New Orleans. I said that that was absolutely impossible. After all, as academics, we don't work on schedules of weeks or months. We talk about years or decades in terms of our work. So I said that can't be done, but what I could do is perhaps to take a look at 2 to 3 environmental problems. We might be able to do an adequate job, at least, with that. And they said, no, we've got to be more comprehensive. We have to make a larger splash with this. It's important. We have to look at 8 to 10. And I was firm, though, and I said, no, it's got to be 2 to 3. They came back and said 8 to 10. We compromised, and we looked at 13. Which tells you something that I assume most of the people here tonight probably already know about the relative negotiating skills of politicians and professors. But it actually says something which is strikingly important in another dimension, and that is that was very much a collaborative effort, which is why we were able to get it done in 5 weeks, and the first draft did go to the Republican National Convention that year. On that first Project 88 effort, there were 50 people involved, experts in environmental policy from across the country. And on Project 88 Round 2, we assembled a team of over 100 leading authorities from private industry, environmental organizations, government, and academia, who contributed papers, they contributed ideas, and importantly, many reviewed manuscripts. And many of these people, by the way, are here tonight. The good news is that many of them are here. The bad news is there are so many that are here that I can't go through the names and thank all of them, which is, of course, what they deserve. Both reports then really reflect the collective vision, I think, of all of those people that worked on them, all of the participants, and the leadership, and the very intense, believe me, the very intense involvement of both Senator Heintz and Senator Wirth. Finally, before introducing Senator Wirth to you, I should acknowledge, to set the record straight, that his interests and activities are, of course, much broader than Project 88 alone. In the environmental area, he is now one of the primary spokespersons in the Congress, in either body, on these issues. He serves, of course, on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where he has become a real leader, in fact, the real leader, on issues of global climate change. We're delighted to welcome him once again to the Kennedy School of Government, Senator Timothy Wirth.
Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you, Robin. I'm delighted to be here. Dean Putnam, thank you very much. And Bill Riley in particular, I want to thank you for continuing to carry the banner in this administration, for which you continue to have our respect and gratitude. Thank you very much. It's a tough job. I know how tough it is. It certainly is that. I on the plane coming up, was making a list of many of the items, the ones that I could remember, that John Heintz and I had worked together. And let me just touch on some of those. Trade. John knew a lot more about that than I did, and I won't presume to suggest that I had any expertise on that. We both struggled at banking and securities. I don't know who was more anesthetized by them, he or me. We both pretended to know an enormous amount, and I continued to do so. Foreign bribery. There were those who believed, and there still are, that in order to be competitive around the world, the United States has got to sanction our companies to bribe. And John was as outraged by that as I was, and so we carried the banner against foreign bribery. I mean, that's not a very positive sort of thing to have to do, but gives you a sense of what we have to do in this world. Law enforcement in the savings and loan industry, to try to convince the Justice Department that, in fact, we ought to invest resources to get the lawyers and accountants to pursue the people who had, in the terms of the law, acquired ill-gotten gain. That's stealing from the taxpayers, is what that means. And how do we recover ill-gotten gain? Children's television and communications law, which Teresa has also been so deeply involved with. How do we have an impact on kids? The greatest leverage is television. I mean, outside of family and church and school, it's television. And let's think about that and think about it seriously. And, by the way, not be spooked by the politics of the networks. The rainforest. John and I put together the famous Senate trip in early 1990 that went to Brazil. And we went just right after the time that Chico Mendes was assassinated. And a perfectly extraordinary trip, for which 2 nights ago at the Environment and Energy Study Institute, great numbers of stories being told, and I won't repeat some of those tonight, but there were about this remarkable trip and impact that we had on, I think, on the relationships between the United States and Brazil, and really making some major changes, one of which was ending up stopping this road that was going to go over the Andes from the westernmost part of the Amazon over the Andes to Peru and across the ocean to Japan. And that was what it was all about, was just sucking out all that good. And it was John Heintz that took that information. He and I brought Robert Gates, the new to be head of the CIA, was then the Deputy National Security Advisor, and we had Mr. Gates down and explained to him that this was truly a national security issue. And John pushed that and pushed it. The President spoke to the Prime Minister of Japan at the time of the Emperor of Japan's funeral, and we stopped that road. I mean, the kind of things you can get done. The Tongass National Forest in southeastern Alaska. We met with President Sarney, the then President of Brazil, and we were at the end of the table, and our delegation was lined up like this, and John and I were there. The President was here, and he had his line of goons going up the other side of the table here, and we began to discuss the rainforest, and he was well prepared. He pulled out his 3x5 card a la Reagan, pulled right over to us, and began to read off from that, well, who are you to be down here telling us about the rainforest in Brazil when you are wantonly tearing down, his word, wantonly tearing down the last great rainforest in North America, the Tongass? I mean, he was really prepared. So John turned to me as we walked out, and he said, "What's that all about?" And I said, "I'll tell you," right? And he grabbed the bit right away and organized enough votes on the Republican side as well, and we stopped the ravaging of the Tongass. Had a number of occasions to visit with Barbara Conable and the World Bank and attempting to turn around what the World Bank was doing. And it was wonderful to have a Republican to work with as well, because there was a sort of a balancing back and forth and a great credibility that he brought with that. We could have Barbara Conable come up, and he would come and feel comfortable sitting in a Republican office perhaps and not a Democratic office. It really worked very well. We were both founding members of the old Environmental Study Conference in 1975 and the Congressional Clearinghouse on the Future a year later. It was really an incredible mix of us and ideologies and so on. We also mixed with body language. And I was able to tell Teresa when John walked on the floor, I could just sense right away when he was in one of those stubborn moods, right? And it was time to get off the floor, right, and get out of the way of the leadership confronting John Heintz because he has something that he wanted to get done, and I was gone. Or he had an uncanny knack of spotting the mischief behind a Worth amendment before I even offered it. I think from time to time that we help to save each other from ourselves, no mean trick in the United States Senate. I also think it's important to note that his politics were different from most. He didn't run for office for the purpose of getting reelected, although he was the most wildly popular politician in the history of Pennsylvania, and a number of us who win with landslide margins elsewhere resent that deeply. But he took instead this prodigious energy and intellect, and he spent absolutely no time on those petty and largely symbolic debates that have, in the Washington of 1991, really ground policymaking to a virtual halt. Rather, he was consumed by a passion to know more about the issues of change that fascinated and absorbed him. And none was more compelling than the issue that you are all here to discuss briefly tonight, the environment, the preservation of the globe, the stewardship of God's creation. In this area, as in so many others, the superficial debate is all around us. People will call it the contrast between the essential need for economic growth and the unrealistic concern for environmental protection, polarized. Hard-nosed reality versus fuzzy-headed dreaming, polarized. Scientific debate versus romantic poetry, polarized. Blue-suited Republicans versus tree-hugging Democrats, polarized. John knew that change was not going to come from one pole or the other, but as a poet whose name was synonymous with industry, as a businessman who had a dream, as a realistic public servant and a committed environmentalist, he worked to get something done. And that's what we're here tonight to talk about. I had a number of quite formal comments about Project 88 Phase 2, and I'm going to cut those short to get us to questions and answers, and would rather just describe very briefly what's in this and where it came from to give you a flavor, perhaps, in the student world of how a public policy process comes together. John and I had talked a good deal about the environment. He had been in the Senate before I was, and I arrived in 1986. And we had talked about market forces and what the Reagan era was doing, some positive, some negative. We had different views of that. But saying, why don't we take the same ideas of the marketplace that have dominated a lot of the discussion and apply those to the environmental world? Why isn't that a logical thing to do? And throughout the end of 1987 and early 1988, attempted to interest various groups in doing so. And as Bill Riley very accurately pointed out, there was enormous skepticism and, in fact, huge resistance to trying to do this. And, in fact, after kind of defining what it was we wanted to do and putting a conceptual base under it, a little stronger than that which Rob suggested, more than 5 or 10 areas, we really had a feeling for how it might work, but were ready to give up until there was an EDF board meeting in New York where Ren and Teresa and one of the key senior staff people from EDF and I had dinner together in the Plaza Hotel in New York. And I was really discouraged about this and was ready to say, we just can't get it going and can't get it off the ground. And the two of them sitting here said, no, you've got to think this through again and let's get going again. And in fact, that got relaunched that winter night at the Plaza Hotel, and John and I then went out and raised the dough and contacted the great Stavens, and away we were. After Project 88 was named to be for 1988 election, it was to be a set of different kinds of thinking for whichever candidate got elected. George Bush or the other guy. And that was designed to be precisely that, and very soon after the new administration came to town, we didn't have it done in time for either convention or the presidency, but we did for the election, but we did have it done in time for the new administration coming in. We found Bill Riley and we found Boyden Gray, now counselor to the president, who was very interested in this sort of thing to do as well, and they injected it into the thinking of the administration and the Clean Air Act. And I must say it was their ability to take this idea and recognize it. We had been at a logjam for 10 years over the Clean Air Act. We couldn't get anywhere because of the problem of equities in acid rain control and utilities. Midwestern utilities tend to be older and burn dirty coal. Utilities around the outside tend to be newer and burn clean coal. So should you penalize the new utilities to clean up the old ones? Do you painfully penalize the hole in the donut, the Middle Westerners, and have the others get advantage? That was the problem. And that plagued us for a decade. And it was the idea of Project 88 that then Bill and Boyden and others really put and injected into the debate, and that broke the logjam. And out of that came, I think, the most significant piece of environmental legislation ever passed, which President Bush signed into law recently. So that's sort of the progression of how this happened. While that was going on, to give you a flavor of how something else transpired, we had a conference in the spring of 1989, which we did with Rob Stavins in Harvard at the Renwick Gallery across the street from the White House. And we had a group of academics there, a group of environmentalists, a number of senior people from the administration, including Bill Riley, Boyden, and a number of others, and a number of people from the Congress, and debated and discussed what this all meant and what kind of change might come out of this. How might this be different? We were proselytizing. Well, when we got done, John and I looked at each other and said, hey, this really got something to it, doesn't it? This is going to happen. And there were three areas that we were particularly interested in. One of those was global warming, been mentioned earlier. A second one was recycling and hazardous materials. And a third one was the public lands in the West. And so we said, let's go out and see if we can take Project 88 and make it much more specific to three major public policy problems. So we went out and again raised the necessary foundation money. Came up to Harvard, and I will say I'm quite proud of this. When we came up to sell Harvard to do this, the sponsors, Senator Heintz and this alumnus of Harvard, wanted to do more than just the research project. And we came up here and sold the university on adding student training, student internships, actual teaching into the project. So Project 88 Round 2 not only is this book, but has a very significant teaching and internship program to it. I know some of you find that as a great surprise in Cambridge, but teaching still should get a priority in any case. We had that impetus that we tried to put on this, and that came out that spring. Those three areas then became part of Project 88 Phase 2. Very briefly, on the global warming side, on the assumption that we're going to get some kind of an agreement at this major world conference in Brazil in June of 1992. We hope that there is. On the assumption that there will be an agreement on greenhouse forcing gases, Project 88 provides a variety of ways of looking at that, on the assumption and how we might do it in a more equitable and inexpensive fashion, in the most cost-effective fashion. On the assumption that one of the protocols that might be agreed upon might be a protocol related to carbon, much as we had a CFC protocol coming out of Montreal about 5 or 6 years ago. If we had a carbon protocol and nations agreed to limit the amount of carbon, how would we go about doing that in the most cost-effective fashion, and in a way as well that would have equities in it that would treat our coal-producing areas of the country, treat that middle western area that is so vulnerable in a more equitable way. So there are some very interesting themes on that, really projected on what would happen if governments got together and set a series of public policy goals. We do not set those goals, of course. That gets done in the political process, like the reduction of sulfur in the Clean Air Act. Once Bill Riley and company decided to make that reduction Project 88 kicks in and says, this is a tool for doing it in a more cost-effective way. Collect our newspapers and put them out on the doorstep on Friday morning, but if they get picked up and going into the same landfill as everything else, we haven't accomplished anything. That happens generally because there's no market for that newspaper. How do we go about creating a market for a newspaper, for that lead, for used tires, of which there are hundreds and hundreds of millions coming into the waste stream every year? A very interesting set of ideas as to how to go about doing that. Finally, looking at the public lands in the West, all of you, many of you probably saw the movie Chinatown. Do you remember that? In which Los Angeles reaches out and drains the Owens Valley in California. Los Angeles wins, gets the water, Owens Valley and the environment loses. There is a winner and a loser. If you look at water policy in the West in a different way, we can develop ways in which there can be a winner and a winner. There is no reason to drain an Owens Valley. You know, it can be done in a much more creative fashion to end up with incentives for the cities to be much more efficient about agriculture, to pay the rural communities to be efficient about agriculture. Some very interesting thoughts about how you change the way of thinking on water law in the West. Also, forest policy. We have 8 times as many roads in national forests as there are miles on the interstate highway system. We keep cutting these roads. The Forest Service loses $1 million a day selling timber. You all are subsidizing that timber. How do we change that way of thinking and change the impact on those timber communities? Some really extraordinary opportunities that face us in the public lands in the West. Very, very important for that legacy that all of us have and I think want to preserve. Just a final note on all of this, the issue of the environment. As a Democrat now, and I will make a partisan comment about my party, it surprises me that we have not picked up this issue and pushed on it with the kind of urgency and care which we should be doing. Some of my colleagues met in Cleveland, you might have seen a couple of weeks ago, jumping up and down and saying, what do the Democrats stand for? You know, it's pretty obvious that there are fundamental things that the Democrats are all about. One of those issues, despite the good works of Bill Riley, is the environment. That is an issue that is our party's. Education is an issue that is our party's. There are various things that we can do. There's a sense of urgency. There's a sense of urgency, however, to be committed in the political process, which is something that all of us must do. I talk to grade school kids, junior high school kids who share that much more unhappily than my colleagues in the Congress, much more than the political process. And if anything comes out of these deliberations and anything comes out of our shared concern, it is that sense of urgency. The world is changing very, very rapidly. We are moving at about 10 miles an hour. I think the destruction of the globe is moving at about 50 miles an hour. It is accelerating, and we're going to have to accelerate much, much faster to catch up, to make sure that there is not that kind of destruction out there that leaves our children or grandchildren with nothing. That's what Project 88 is, one of many steps. We just urge all of you, as you look at your own futures as students, you look at your commitments in public policy, that it must be related to this single, most important issue that everybody here at the podium shares and you all share, or you wouldn't be here tonight. Thank you all very much.
We'll now begin to take some questions from the audience. If those of you who are interested in asking a question will move to one of the 2 microphones that we have set up on the main floor. In the interest of time, and also because nearly everyone here, I'm sure, came to hear from our panelists, let me remind you what a question is. A question here is something that's combined of a very small number of words and it ends in a question mark. So we welcome brief questions, but we don't welcome speeches. And with that, let me start over here, please.
Let's try. Welcome to the Kennedy School, Mr. Riley. This report and a lot of other academic work seems to set a solid framework for using market incentives. The application and implementation is largely left to be done. It seems that the area of energy use and the combustion of fossil fuels is one area where the application of market incentives has great potential. And it's an issue which affects us at the local, regional, and global level as well. Project 88 devotes a full 7 pages, and if you take out the footnotes, that's really quite a bit, to consideration of carbon charges to reduce overall energy use, fossil fuel use. But it doesn't seem, I haven't heard much talk of implementation of that at the national level in the United States, given that this is a new and powerful policy tool, and given that the area of energy resource is ripe for its application. Do you see anything in the near future, any likelihood of application of market incentives for energy use in the U.S.?
Can I say a word before Administrator Riley responds that the proposal is, I believe, is for revenue neutral carbon charges, of cut down other taxes and then charges on carbon. Administrator Riley.
I see even you are paranoid about taxes. Right?
That's right.
That's not a word we use in the Bush administration, that 3-letter word. We have an equivalent, however, with respect to the manufacture and use of chlorofluorocarbons. A fee was imposed that accelerates, that rises over the next 5 years, and that is intended to discourage the production, the profit really, from these substances we hope to phase out, and to develop encourage some incentives for their replacement, for their substitution. It's a significant fee. It will raise some $5 billion for the general fund in that period. And I think in some part at least attributable to that fee, we are seeing now companies phase out of these substances, find substitutes possible, develop the technology to replace them. In some cases, as in the one corporation I mentioned in my remarks, eliminate some solvents altogether by rethinking their technology and their processes. We are 23% ahead of where we expected to be. We've reduced 23% more the CFC use in the United States in 1991 vis-a-vis what we had anticipated when we entered into the treaty, into the protocol last summer. The possibility of using some kind of tax to achieve our greenhouse gas reductions is one that we look very seriously at. We've done a good deal of research and analysis. We don't, I think, in the current climate, have the prospect realistically. You're talking seriously about taxes. The President and the congressional leadership did, in fact, propose a 25-cent a gallon gas tax increase last fall, and not even environmental organizations supported that initiative at the time. We found the country did not want to see that, was, in fact, very strongly opposed to it, and that has been effectively removed from any kind of near-term public policy possibility. But when it does become a possibility to address climate change, should that be appropriate, after we have a framework convention, it may well be that that's as efficient a means as any. We could conceive of using it, and your analysis in Project 88 has been helpful to this, and we have an analysis of it also in the Environmental Protection Agency's report on incentives, economic incentives. That could be a way of getting relatively efficient decisions to be made in a variety of countries on an equivalent basis, and creating the possibility of doing at the international scale what we're doing in the acid rain title on the national scale, and that is positing the potential for the most cost-effective reductions to be pursued in the place where they are, possibly by a country that finds in its own nation very expensive choices confronting it. So I think it's one of those tools that's open to us, and should the moment arise, should the science be compelling, should the international community come together, as we hope they will next summer in Rio on a framework convention, we may pursue further.
If I might just add very briefly, and this is not Bill Riley's deal, but it is Mr. Sununu's. If one looks at a rational energy policy, that energy policy should recognize that we in the United States use energy in twice as profligate fashion as anybody else in the world. For each unit of gross national product, we use twice as much energy as the Germans and the Japanese. Not a perfect parallel by any means, but instructive and illustrative. The attempts of Admiral Watkins and company to develop programs that were really going to stress energy efficiency, which is the single cheapest, most cost-effective way of us to get energy, is to save energy. Every unit of dollar you invest, you get twice as much. Anyway, was pretty much killed by the White House. Unfortunately, we're now in the battle in the Energy Committee of trying to rewrite the bill and get some modicum of rationality back into it. It's not easy. Developing CAFE standards for automobiles, the standards that are higher, really pushing alternative fuels, alternative fuel vehicles, that whole group of things that are very cost effective. If you apply a Project 88 sort of analysis, you come out looking at energy conservation and looking at alternative fuels. Those are the most cost-effective ways of achieving the goal, which presumably, after the Persian Gulf situation, should be the backing out of foreign oil and not the use of more foreign oil.
Question from this side, please.
I presume you would all agree that environmental policy, whether regulation or market, is only as good as the science underlying it. I wonder how confident the EPA is regarding its science. In particular, in the last year, there has been a flurry of letters to the editor in the American Chemical Society Weekly magazine from people who describe themselves as charter members of the EPA, complaining about interference by what they call political environmentalists in what they call themselves, I presume, scientific environmentalists. I wondered what Mr. Riley's views are, whether you're familiar with this controversy and what your views are regarding political environmentalists versus scientific environmentalists.
I'm all for a scientific environmentalist, always have been. Hope I'm one of them myself. We have increased the budget for science, for research and development in our agency very significantly.
I think they're complaining about the implementation of policy, not just the science.
Well, the first thing that I did upon taking office was to ask our Science Advisory Board, which is an independent body of scientists, to tell me what are the most serious threats to the environment of the people of the United States, and to what degree do the programs and the resource allocations of our agency line up with those
And
threats.
they were often quite wrong, weren't they?
Well, they don't correspond, but I don't think you should jump to the conclusion that it's necessarily our people who are responsible. These reflect the values and judgments of the people of the United States. They conform almost precisely to public polls about
Perhaps
the seriousness of environmental problems.
Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're going to stay with questions, not dialogue. Thank you.
I see it as my role to try to inform this debate, and I think the Science Advisory Board's report has done that. And not necessarily to suggest that the views of the experts and scientists should in every case line up with those of the public. They don't with respect to hazardous waste, for example. But at least to make clear to the Congress and the country that when they don't line up, a choice is being made that is at odds with the views of the professionals. I think before we're finished, we will have significantly enhanced the understanding of what science has to offer public policy in the environment, and possibly in the process improved the cost effectiveness of what we do, so that we're pursuing the most serious risks with the largest amounts of money, and perhaps paying disproportionately less attention to those things that threaten fewer lives and less environmental disruption of our ecosystems. So I'm very proud of our record for trying to integrate good science with public policy in the administration on really across the board.
Yes. Question from this side, please.
I have a question about energy conservation in federal buildings. Energy conservation has broad support. There's an apparent stalemate in Congress between conservation and drilling on the wildlife refuge, despite willingness of environmentalists to look again at offshore and a new generation of nuclear power. Energy conservation basically capitalizes an expense.
Is this leading to, is this
yes,
a question or?
Yes.
Thank you.
Separate accounting in federal government and prohibitions against budget augmentation, among other problems, have been recognized as early as the Carter administration. The Alliance to Save Energy report recently released clearly shows that little progress has been made. Even in Massachusetts, the DSM programs are unable to deliver energy conservation in federal buildings on a regular basis. will we be able to get the federal government to set an example?
Senator Wirth is going to respond to the second part of that question. I'm going to respond to the first by reminding this audience that a few weeks ago, President Bush signed an executive order calling for a 20% reduction in the energy use by the federal establishment, the federal agencies. A very significant goal with quite specific methods of implementation that we're proud of and expect to achieve.
I'd like to read it.
I also chair the Alliance to Save Energy, which is a national energy conservation group. And we've come up with a number of interesting ideas which we're trying to get into the implementation of the goal set by the President. One of them, for example, relates to the Department of Defense, where we had some luck 3 years ago, a Project 88 kind of idea, to give you a flavor of how this works. We were having trouble getting bases in Europe to save energy until we developed the idea, which an imaginative Army Assistant Secretary of the Army carried out, which was to allow the troops on that base to take half of the savings from energy use and apply it to the Health and Welfare Fund, which is the education and the health of their kids. Energy bills at those bases started to drop off significantly because what they were doing every time they turned off the lights, turned down the heat, and did that sort of thing, they were benefiting their kids. Well, nothing wrong with a little bit of self-interest in all of that. Now that's just one of many, many things that we can do, from requiring the federal government to buy more fuel-efficient automobiles, but more importantly, to take the lead in pulling the market on alternative fuel vehicles, having the federal government have a certain percentage of buildings that are solar-powered, and so on. There are a variety of things that we ought to be doing. Mr. Riley's agency has been terrific on that. The Department of Energy has, for the most part, been good on that. The problem is that we're running into are other blocks a little higher up in the administration.
I might add a little war story of my own in terms of roadblocks a little lower in the administration. I had asked the administrator for the General Services Administration to come into my office. My office was one of the only ones on Capitol Hill that had been retrofitted by the Electrical Manufacturers Association.
You had to see this place to believe it. That's true.
Because of the pioneer work that I had done in energy efficiency technology. And I kept saying, seeing is believing. If we can show folks that this technology works, then we can get more rapid acceptance of that policy. Well, regrettably, the head of the GSA was not moved, but I will say that it takes perseverance, and it takes more than one person to push such policies, and it takes the scientific and academic community to play a more political role in pushing this agenda. And I think part of my greatest frustration as a member of Congress was to see that many of the people who had some of the best solutions in their head were not able to take those ideas and move them into action, political action, in order to get a change. The only other footnote I would like to add is that I first introduced legislation for least cost energy planning back in 1985. In 1985, I practically had to kill to get $1 million budget every year at the Department of Energy. Well, the good news is that finally this year they increased the budget by 500%. So that now least cost energy planning has finally, as far as I'm concerned, been institutionalized. And the responsibility is up to those who carry on to make sure that we keep that kind of level funding going. But it does require constant butting at that dam, but it's happening.
From this side, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, the President has a policy that you, Mr. Riley, are helping to bravely implement, no net loss of wetlands. I'm wondering if you could comment on the current rulemaking regarding the definition of wetlands and possibly some possibilities for incorporating Project 88 type solutions into that ambitious policy.
Very interesting question. It's our wetlands efforts, particularly those to redefine the wetlands themselves in a new delineation manual, I know have been well received in Boston. And, I read the press earlier this week. We essentially, to those of you who have not been familiar with this, found that the agencies that administer our wetlands program, there are four: Soil Conservation Service, Corps of Engineers, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Environmental Protection Agency, issued a manual just before this administration came to office that has been in practice subject to a lot of misunderstanding and confusion. And we set out to provide a clearer definition of precisely which wetlands are subject to our authority. One senator from New England State indicated that 40% of his state met the technical criterion of hydric soils sufficient to make that area subject to my and the Corps of Engineers authority. The eastern shore of Maryland, about half of it comes within the definition of this 89 manual. Much of suburban Houston and South Carolina and North Carolina also apparently fall within that category. And needless to say, that is not a program that I neither want to nor really could administer. Not that much of the country is wet. We have now completed a draft to redevelop the criteria for wetlands and have said that they essentially have to be characterized by 3 criteria. They have to have hydrophytic plants, hydric soils, and inundation for 14 days of the growing season, or saturation. And if they don't look wet, if they're not saturated during that period, then the burden really is on the government regulators to try to explain why they are wet and maintain the authority. The relevance of trading potentially is quite clear to me, that ultimately if we want to achieve no net loss of wetlands and touch upon people's property rights, which are very deeply felt, which are protected in our Constitution, even when they have very important environmental values, as wetlands do, we're going to need principles of equivalency so that when the moment comes to trade certain wetlands for the inevitable airport extension or highway construction or whatever, we make sure we get equivalent value. We're going to need mitigation banks so that there's a place that you can go to get wetlands credits in those instances. We're going to need a market, I think, ultimately. We're going to need also a program, though, that makes clear that we are not going to yield further. We're going to hold the line on that half of the wetlands that we still have after 200 years since colonization in this country. We don't have those things yet. I very much hope we'll get them, and I think one of the promises of projects like these is that they can help us achieve that objective, a very difficult one, and politically very contentious and controversial now. There are 120 sponsors in the House of Representatives for a bill to strip EPA totally of its authority to regulate wetlands. And that's how serious the backlash against a vigorous program the President committed to, no net loss of wetlands, has become.
That's going to have to be the last question for the evening. Virtually everything that we've heard this evening I want to take note of is really part of the environmental legacy of Senator John Heintz, a legacy of great commitment to the development of innovative and effective policies for environmental protection. As we've also heard throughout the evening, I think, there is now a very keen interest in such market-based environmental strategies in Washington, both within the administration and in the Congress, in the state capitals, and as we heard today at our workshop, in local communities, and for that matter, as has been said by the panelists, in numerous other countries. This high level of interest, importantly, and activity is yet another aspect of the legacy of John Heintz. Finally, I want to express my appreciation to our distinguished panelists, to Administrator Riley, Senator Wirth, and Congresswoman Schneider for having taken time out of their exceptionally busy schedules to join us here tonight. And lastly, thanks to all of you for your attention, your participation, and most important, really, for your consideration of these very important issues and ideas. Good night.